There's a question nobody really asks about Generation X. Not what do they want? Not how do we reach them? Not even what do they think? The question nobody asks is, are they okay? And the answer is complicated. Because Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, learned very early that nobody was going to ask that question, so they stopped waiting for it. Let's start with something called attachment theory. It's one of the most studied concepts in developmental psychology. The idea is simple. Children who form secure attachments with caregivers develop a stable internal sense of self. They learn the world is safe, that people show up, that they matter. Gen X ran a different experiment. They were the original latchkey generation. By the mid-1980s, millions of children across North America were coming home to empty houses every single day. No parent, no supervision, just a key on a string around their neck and instructions not to open the door for strangers. Psychologists studying that era found something interesting. These kids didn't become broken. They became adaptive. They developed what researchers call dismissive avoidant attachment patterns, a psychological configuration where self-sufficiency isn't just preferred, it's compulsive. The brain essentially rewires to say, I don't need anyone. And that's fine. That rewiring didn't disappear when they grew up. It became their operating system. Here's what that looks like in practice. Gen X manages crisis with an almost eerie calm. When everything falls apart, the job, the relationship, the plan, they tend to get quieter, more focused, more efficient. While other people spiral outward, they collapse inward. Not because they don't feel it, but because feeling it was never really on the schedule. Dr. Jean Twenger, who has studied generational psychology extensively, has noted that Gen X consistently scores lower than other cohorts on measures of neuroticism, not because their lives were easier, but because their nervous systems learned early that panic is a luxury they couldn't afford. That empty house taught them, you are the first responder, you always have been. Now add to that something researchers call institutional betrayal. Gen X watched Watergate unfold on television. They watched the Iran-Contra hearings. They watched the AIDS crisis get systematically ignored by the government for years while people died. They watched their parents pour decades into companies that handed out layoff notices without a second thought. Every institution that was supposed to be trustworthy, government, corporations, even the family unit itself as divorce rates spiked, turned out to be unreliable at best, corrupt at worst. The psychological result? A generation that developed what some researchers describe as calibrated skepticism. Not nihilism, not apathy. Something more precise. A deep, evidence-based distrust of systems, combined with an equally deep trust in individuals who have proven themselves. That's why Gen X respects competence over credentials. Why they'll work themselves into the ground for a manager they respect and quietly undermine one they don't. Why they're loyal to people, almost never to brands or institutions. There's a concept in psychology called ironic detachment, using humor and distance as emotional regulation tools. And nobody weaponized this more effectively than Gen X. They grew up on shows that broke the fourth wall, on movies that knew they were movies, on music that was suspicious of sincerity. Sarcasm wasn't just a personality trait, it was a coping mechanism. When adults in their childhood kept delivering contradictions, everything is fine / the nuclear threat is real / don't worry / be very, very careful, kids adapted by developing a dual awareness, taking things seriously on the inside while maintaining ironic distance on the outside. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance tolerance, and Gen X has it in remarkable quantities. They can hold two opposing truths at the same time without needing to resolve them. It's not confusion, it's a feature. But here's where the psychology gets genuinely poignant. All that self-sufficiency, all that ironic armor, all that competence, it comes with a cost. Gen X often struggles to ask for help. Not in a proud, stubborn way, in a deeply conditioned way, in a I literally don't have the internal script for this way. Research published in the Journal of Adult Development found that Gen Xers report significantly lower rates of seeking social support during high-stress periods than both boomers and millennials. Not because they lack relationships, many have deep, loyal friendships, but because asking for help still registers as failure somewhere in the circuitry. It's the empty house again. You figured it out then. You'll figure it out now. This also shapes how Gen X processes identity. Boomers defined themselves by their ideals. Millennials defined themselves by their experiences. Gen X tends to define themselves by what they can do. This is a generation that grew up fixing things with their hands, calculating change without a calculator, navigating cities without GPS. They built their identity around competence and capability, not because they were arrogant, but because, "Can I do this?" was the first question asked in every new situation. Psychologists describe this as a mastery-oriented identity, and it's remarkably resilient. When the job changes, Gen X adapts. When the industry pivots, they learn the new tool. When everything shifts beneath them, as it has economically, repeatedly, they don't mourn who they were. They figure out who they need to become. It's efficient, it's impressive, and it can also be quietly exhausting in ways they rarely admit. Here's the last thing. Gen X is now in its mid-40s to early 60s. They're watching a world that seems increasingly anxious, increasingly fragile, increasingly dependent on validation that used to come from within. And they are not judging it. Not exactly. They understand, intellectually, that being raised with someone who checked in, who asked how you were, who made the house feel full, that produces a different kind of person, not weaker, just wired differently. But they do carry a quiet dissonance, because they raised their own kids with all the presence and attention they never had. They asked the questions nobody asked them. They showed up. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they still wonder if any of that was enough. That's the thing about growing up in an empty house. You can fill every house after it. But the silence has a shape, and you carry it. Generation X doesn't post about that. They just do the work. If this resonated with you, subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology that shapes who we are. If this made you think, subscribe. We'll be here. We always figure it out anyway.